So we're here today with Representative Graig Meyer and representing Orange and Chatham counties, Orange and Caswell counties in the General Assembly. We're here to talk to you about redistricting. So I have a couple of questions, and of course you can, you're free to also just use a question to answer whatever you want to answer. One, just to take a general question, why do you think it's important that we get some kind of redistricting reform sooner or later in North Carolina in order to protect our democracy?
I mean, redistricting reform is really the first and most fundamental reform we should have for democracy and for elections that are more clearly representative of who our population is, because I'm also concerned about the influence of money on politics and election law and ballot access, all of those things. But even if you get all of those right, if you don't have fair districts and you don't have maps that mean that people have a chance to openly express their opinion, have a chance of having their vote matter, then people are still in a bad position. So if we can have some type of independent redistricting process and a process that emphasizes competitive districts instead of emphasizing districts that are clearly biased to favor one party, that's just better for democracy and it's better for people who want their voices heard.
Yeah, of course, we strongly agree with that. When you look at the way the map performed, it performed almost exactly as designed, with primarily safe seats for both parties. Frankly, we don't think this is really a partisan issue because it really does. It creates safe seats for both parties. Just creates more of them for whoever's controlling the pen at the time. Pretty much.
Right.
There have been some very interesting bills introduced in both the House and Senate. We know it's going to be very tough to get them passed, but what we're trying to do with our day of action is to encourage our members and other people. We're reaching out very broadly to our partners and so forth to get involved in trying to encourage these bills to be heard in committee. What do you think? What do you think is the best way to bring that about? What can we do to encourage these bills, which are across the board? Some of them are processing criteria and so forth, to at least get a hearing in committee.
Well, I think it's important to recognize the timeline that we're likely to be on for redistricting this year, and we're not going to begin redistricting until sometime this fall. And so we have a long lead time at this point, several months at least. And having those conversations is I think where we start now. Of what are we going to be doing, thinking about in the fall, and then we will get to the fall whenever we decide to have that redistricting session, and things will move very quickly. And so you can't really wait to lay the groundwork to that point. That's the conversations that have to happen now. I think that the redistricting process likely will be very similar to what the last redistricting was, but and that is what Senator Berger has said, and I think he likely will stick to that. The only way to really significantly change that, I think, is to have a lot of demand from the public. And so I would encourage advocates to think not just about how you get your existing base to communicate to legislators, but how do you build the number and volume of voices of people who are engaged in talking to legislators about redistricting reforms.
There was a poll, I suppose you probably have seen it, that just came out recently from public policy polling, which is sometimes seen as liberal leaning, but no, they've got to make a living as pollsters, so they also have to be accurate. This found, I think, really for the first time, that a substantial majority of Republicans, that answered the poll, favor redistricting reform. And so I'm sort of hopeful. I don't know whether that's because they really hate all the court cases, the constant changing in maps, or what it is, but what do you think? Do you think that there is more recognition on both sides in terms of the voting base, not so much in terms of the legislature? I'm asking more about the voters. Do you think that there is more interest in reform?
Well, I mean, that poll is a hopeful sign that there was, right? But what it doesn't tell us is who are those voters and why are they more interested? And I don't know that you're going to get that from a poll, but I do think that advocacy organizations should try to figure out how to talk to those people. And if you got enough money, you can run a focus group with some of them to learn. But even if you're just running a grassroots organizing campaign, I think that poll really calls on advocates to try and reach out and figure out if you can find some of those Republican redistricting reform supporters to join your advocacy efforts. In North Carolina, over the last 10 years, redistricting reform has really been driven mostly by Democrats, certainly in terms of policy proposals, but also in terms of organizations that are identified as being liberal or Democratic leaning. That wasn't always true in North Carolina. But for the previous 2 decades, it was really pushed by Republicans and Republican leaning organizations. So where is the common ground that can be found and the coalitions that can be built this year?
Yeah, I think it is very important. I mean, we've tried to reach out broadly, and I have found, in speaking around the state, when you can get in front of a Republican audience, they're actually very supportive. I find in particular the concept of accountability, because of course, when legislators are in safe seats, it's very difficult for their voters to hold them accountable. And this, this tends to mean that although the board, it may not, the voters may, that they still want what they want ideologically, but I mean, this may not be a super popular, point of view with you, but I think it's very important to elect the people that you want, but it's at least as important to be able to vote them out if you don't like what they're doing.
Yes, for sure. That's part of the democratic process.
Yes, and that's something that you can't do as easily if they're in safe seats. And so that is something that I find does speak very well across the aisle.
Yeah, I like it. I have not used that line before. I might borrow that from you, Jennifer.
Okay, feel free. So it's interesting that you're saying about the timing. I was just actually on a call with Stacey Carlos and the NC Counts group, which is going to be focusing more on redistricting, which I think is a great development. It brings a lot of skill and a lot of on the ground knowledge from having worked on the census and done a great job in trying to improve the number of people who responded to that. So the court challenges that we've had, I know the court cases are not very popular, but it has been one of the ways that that we have been able to see improved maps after very biased maps have been drawn. How do you think, what impact do you think that will have? The fact that we've had these court cases, we could still have court cases. What do you think that will have on this year's redrawing? The concern about whether the maps will stand up.
I mean, I think that we likely should plan for another decade of litigation, because unless we move to an independent process, and even in that case, there may still be litigation over how the independent process worked. But if we continue with the process where the majority party essentially gets to dictate what the maps look like, the minority party will always want to litigate that. And there's still enough ground in state court for some wins for the minority party that I think that that litigation will be part of what happens. And I fully expect that since we as Democrats are in the minority party, I expect that part of our strategy for how we approach the redistricting negotiations this year will be with one eye on a potential litigation strategy. Because if we can't win, if we can't get fair maps through the legislative process, we have to depend on the courts.
Yeah, I think they made a real difference. We really, they and it has been shown, and I think very interesting that the courts have been receptive to the arguments that have been presented using mathematical modeling to gin up, tens of thousands of maps, and then show to give an idea when you apply the past election data to those maps, that it gives you an idea of how that district would normally, perform. And can look at whether the map as drawn is or rather how that map would perform, and get an idea of whether that map is that produced is out of line with where the vast possible range of maps is. This has been introduced as a bill, and I think it is very interesting. And I don't know whether it's going to be something that's going to be a little bit difficult to talk to voters about. We're certainly going to be doing that, but that has been very effective, I think, in the courts, and it's nice to see some really concrete criteria because that's been something that's been really missing in North Carolina, is how do you really, and other states, how do you measure a gerrymander? Do you think there's going to be receptivity to having some more concrete measures, whether that one or other types of measures, to give some teeth to the process itself?
My layman's interpretation of what the courts decided in 2019 was that it definitely needs to be done better than it had been done previously, but that if legislators could agree on maps, essentially if there was a bipartisan vote for maps, that was good enough to meet the court's expectation. And the problem with that is that any majority party can always get some members of, not always, but potentially always get some members of the minority party to vote for the maps if the minority party members' districts are good for them personally, right? If it gives them a safe seat. And so you can have a bipartisan approval of maps without having those maps be fair. And I don't know the court's willingness to dive deeper into that issue. And I don't know if the mathematical models, I mean, they can help illustrate that, but I don't know if they're enough to convince the court to intervene on that. And so I think that means to me that there's also a role for advocates in trying to talk directly to legislators about why you shouldn't just take the deal that's in your own best interest, but think about what's in the best interest for the people of North Carolina. And I think that's part of why some of the bills that have been filed and some of what you and others have been advocating for is about standards, along with, as part of the process, right? Of like, we should at least have these standards for what we think makes for a fair districting process or a fair map, because then at least if you met the standards, you got some other measurement besides did both Democrats and Republicans vote for the map.
And I've been pleased to see the courts be willing, because when you see the districts lined up and you see a little row of dots of where all of the simulated maps are, and then over here someplace is where the legislature's map is, and that really seems to convince them that something has gone wrong in the process. So that's kind of encouraging. Talk to directly to our people who hopefully are going to be hearing these questions. I know you have to run. So what would you want to say to them in terms of what they should be doing to really try to influence this process? I mean, what do you want us to do?
I think that if I know your audience, and I certainly know some of your audience, like, y'all know why this is an issue, and you know what your talking points are on the issue. And you're probably very frustrated by your inability to make an impact on the issue over the last 10 years and wondering what can you do this year, given that Republicans maintain control of the General Assembly. And so I think my encouragement is to just broaden your reach of who you can engage and who can speak with you. And again, thinking about that evidence that there is growing Republican support for fair redistricting process. How can you find those people and work with them and bring them into your coalition? That's, to me, is the work that hasn't been done yet that could make a difference this year.
Well, thank you. I mean, I strongly agree. We're going to keep at it. We found it can be difficult to get conservatives in the room, but when we do, they're on board.
Right.
Even county chairs from the other party have been receptive. So that's I think that's good advice, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I know it's a super busy time in the legislature, and I hope to see you soon.
Glad to see you, Jennifer. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.